In a wild place dotted with ancient cairns, standing stones, and burial mounds lies the entrance to a nightmare realm close to hell. Beneath the many barrows which cling to the edge of a fetid swamp is a sepulchral world of endless twisting tunnels and crumbling, ghost-haunted chambers. Pack extra oil for the lantern and steel your nerves as we prepare to enter the Barrowmaze. Hi everyone, I'm Gary, and today we're going to talk about Barrowmaze by Greg Gillespie. What a wonderful module this is. I'm really excited to talk about it. Now let's just get the basic stuff out of the way first. It's 259 pages in total, including a kind of collection of artwork at the back that you show your players as they go through it. And it's a mega dungeon, so it's kind of a setting book sort of, and a module like adventure module sort of. Neither of which perfectly describe what it is, but both, it's kind of a mixture of the two. It's written for Labyrinth Lord, and therefore it's going to work for any old school D&D retro clone. Labyrinth Lord is an early BX retro clone, so it's going to work for old school essentials, I imagine. Most people are going to run it with now, and you could even run it with Greg Gillespie's own retro clone, Dragonslayer. I'll put a link to Dragonslayer below in case anybody wants to check that out. Now, this is the first in a series of mega dungeons that Greg Gillespie has written. The others being the Forbidden Caverns of Archaea, Highfell, and most recently, Dwarrow-Deep. Now, I've run some of the others. I don't own a copy of Archaea, but I've run quite a lot of Highfell, and I own, but haven't run yet, any of Dwarrow-Deep. The module acts as a mega dungeon, and therefore it's designed to take characters from first level right up through a kind of a whole campaign's worth of levels. And let's just talk about my bona fides before we get going. Now, normally, with these videos, what I do is I'd say, okay, I've run the module this number of times for these systems. That doesn't really work for a mega dungeon. And the reason it doesn't really work for me to just tell you that is because with mega dungeons, there's no kind of clear beginning, really, and there's no clear end. There's not like a narrative sequence or series of events that I can say, yep, I've gone from the beginning to the end several times. It's much more kind of like, it's not linear at all. It's much more kind of spread out, and players choose how they want to interact with Barrowmaze as a mega dungeon. So what I will say is that I've run it for between 30 to 35 sessions, and I've run it for, up to, well, how do I say this? I've run it for 3 groups that have all interacted with it to varying degrees, with one group in particular getting quite far and getting into the kind of factional play of the dungeon. Every single time I've run it with my own system, Journeyman Expert Master, which is not an old school compatible system, but it is old school adjacent in the sense that the principles that are guiding it are very kind of like traditional old school. So it was completely fine to run with Gem and worked really, really well. This module can be run for like an innumerable number of sessions, so long as the players have a reason to keep interested in it. And that is the flaw and the benefit of any mega dungeon. I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about goal-orientated play and why that is really relevant here. So what's the through line, the kind of narrative, the overarching narrative for Barrowmaze? It's really simple, actually, and that's to the module's credit. Long ago, a group of nomads settled in the area near a kind of desolate moor. These people, according to their tradition, entombed their dead in barrows, right? Kind of like raised structures like of earth and kind of like stone that they then kind of put their dead in. Nurgle, the lord of the underworld, invaded the region and ordered his cultists to take his most powerful artifact, the Tablet of Chaos, and to hide it somewhere. The cult of Nurgle built tunnels and chambers beneath this moor where these barrow mounds were. And over time, what happened was these tunnels started to kind of like corrupt and touch on the bottom of the barrows. And eventually, the locals came to speak of this kind of ancient, crumbling, I suppose, underworld fortress beneath the kind of the Barrow Downs, as they dubbed it Barrowmaze, and that's what the kind of like the location of the adventure is. Now, the cult of Nurgle locked the Tablet of Chaos away in Barrowmaze, and in these tunnels. Now, what happened was Nurgle's 2 jealous sons, Orcus and Set, because this is just great. Like, I love all these classically named gods. Orcus and Set, they jealously kind of like usurped their own father Nurgle, and now their cult, their respective cultists, battle for control of Barrowmaze. in its kind of like crumbling, ghost-haunted tunnels. It's like really good fun. Now, where we're up to, well, the adventurers, your party, have arrived in this area. They can pick up a couple of rumours, but basically what they're going to be doing is they're going to be breaking into Barrowmaze, and fairly quickly they're going to find an entrance in one of these Barrowmaze, or maybe just on the downs in general, into Barrowmaze, like into the series of tunnels that connect this labyrinth. So what do I like about this module? There's loads of content. I mean, there's loads. There's over 400 rooms. There's about 70 barrows on the surface. So you just, and you know, the barrows themselves, I would say, just that surface where there's like 70 or so barrows that they can break into, some of which are totally covered in earth and they'd have to scrape things away and have a look. Some of which have already been broken into, some of which are kind of like isolated. They're not connected to Barrowmaze itself. They're just kind of like secluded dungeons, like mini dungeons. They're really, really, really good fun. It's almost worth the price of entry just for the barrow section. And that's something that I just think is really, really, really good fun. The dungeon itself is fantastic because what it is when we usually run mega dungeons, we telegraph the danger to players by saying the deeper you go, the more dangerous it's going to get. And players, when they come to sets of stairs or you know, slides or whatever, how they get down, they're very aware. It's a really useful way of telegraphing dangers that the deeper you go, you're like stepping up the ante. And when they go down a set of stairs, like, okay, we know this is about to get more rewarding in terms of treasure, but it's also probably going to get more dangerous. Well, it's going to get more dangerous. That's the point of it. And they can kind of, I suppose they can kind of be a little bit gamist and a little bit kind of overthink that a little bit. And maybe actually sometimes I think that is a little bit overwrought. And one thing that this module does, what Gillespie has done in this dungeon design, one, the design is amazing. I'll talk about that in a moment. But instead of doing this as a series of levels, it is all designed on one singular level. It's designed horizontally. And most of the entrances are on the western end of the Barrow Downs. And the western end of Barrowmaze underground is much safer, much more accessible to lower level characters than the eastern end, which is full of all sorts of things. Right? There's a bone dragon, there's a lich, there's all this sort of stuff at the western end. But in the eastern end, they're going to see things like zombies and skeletons, and they're going to be able to kind of manage a little bit more. And I do think that perhaps it is worth saying to players, especially if they're players, you know, if they're old school players like mine, which are aware of these kind of principles of dungeon design and game mastery in terms of, you know, like the deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. It might be worth just saying you do realize you can sense the kind of growing sense of evil and corruption the further west you go. And then that just telegraphs really carefully or really clearly that, you know, if you go the further west you go, the more chambers you break through to the west, it's going to get more and more dangerous. Let's just talk about the dungeon design itself. The first time you see this map, it is totally, totally overwhelming, because there is hundreds of rooms. Now, the good things that's going on here, there's multiple entrances. I've talked about that before, multiple entrances. When I talked about designing a dungeon on here, I designed a really small barrow dungeon, ironically. The barrow of Balagrim, if I put a link up to that in the top right, you can have a look at that. But multiple entrances gives players a sense of both agency in terms of choosing how they enter, but also a sense of discovery as they find multiple, or, you know, other ways in and out. And they're like, okay, this is like a shortcut back to where we were. So that can be really helpful. There's lots of loops. The thing about a mega dungeon is if players just feel like they're heading down a linear path, right, or even just like a branching path where there's one like main highway through the dungeon and they're just kind of checking the rooms at the side, that gets really boring really quickly. This is really cool. There's lots of loops, lots of secret passageways, and one element I particularly like that is gamist, right, is there are bricked up corridors that are telegraphed really clearly where there had been tunnels there previously in the Barrowmaze, and players can kind of like smash them down with sledges. As soon as they realize it's my players, that was the first thing they bought. They were like, right, we're going to need sledgehammers. We're going to come back and break through some of these kind of like thinly bricked up walls. And that's cool because then that provokes random encounter tests as the kind of like the sound of like a hammer on stone draws the attention of the maze itself. And that's really good fun. I like the fact that with those, it's almost like a video game. You could kind of say, like, I don't know if you ever played video games where once you're really proficient in a particular game, you notice when a particular asset or something is not the same as everything else. You're like, okay, I'm going to go check that out, and maybe it's a secret door. And it was a little bit like that with these bricked up doorways, which were really, really, really cool. The other thing I like is one criticism that is sometimes leveled at Barrowmaze, and I think it's leveled at by people who've only read it rather than people who've actually run a lot of this dungeon, is that there's a lot of undead. Right, players have to enjoy fighting undead. I'll come back to this as a kind of problem in a few minutes. But I do like the idea of the undead. It's like once they enter Barrowmaze itself from through the kind of like upper level of like the Barrow, like downs, like the normal downs, it does feel like we're entering the mythic underworld, and the undead become this almost this environmental hazard that are kind of pressing in amongst the players. It reminds me of like when I've read like The Walking Dead, and they're like don't want to make a noise because there's like tens of thousands of zombies, and they're kind of going to close in. It did feel a little bit like that. It felt tense when I've run this, and it felt like players are almost trying to be stealthy throughout. You know, apart from the smashing through walls, but that's something that they've got to do. Another thing is I'm always looking. I'm a mechanics guy. I'm a rules guy. I like having interesting rules for things. I like purchasing modules and source books that give me more rules. I don't just want flavor. This is a real criticism I have of a lot of the 5e splat books, because I'm just kind of, it's all kind of thin gruel. I'm not kind of giving any more meat. You know, you read there kind of the remake of Ghost of Saltmarsh. It's like, where's the rules? Where's the like really detailed rules for like trading on ships or ship combat? Same for their planes, their spelljammers. Like, where's the stuff for space combat? Right? I want mechanics, and Gillespie does give us quite a few mechanics. Now, one thing that he gives us that I think is really helpful is players are going to plunder lots of funerary niches all at once, like lots of shelves like full of like urns and like bodies and stuff like that. And he gives us a mechanic for working out how long this will take. And that's really important because as an old school style module, you need to know how long things are taking for checking for things like random encounter tests, how long torches are going to last, right? Because chances are players are not going to want to use light because it's going to cost them a spell slot or FP in my game, Journeyman Expert Master. It's a bit more kind of like resource management as a form of tension. So you want to know how long it's going to take them to loot like 50 or 100 funerary niches. And he gives us really clear rules for how fast they can do that and how much a player character can loot a particular, you know, how many numbers of niches they can loot in a 10-minute exploration turn. And what this prompted in play for me is, and my groups, one especially, was really interesting granular decisions like, okay, we've got this room and we're enjoying the looting, but are we going to have to, should we have everyone just get through this and quickly like search all of these funerary niches all at once? And that will mean that we can kind of get it done much faster. But then don't we need someone to kind of stand watch and with, you know, listening out for the approach of shuffling feet or anything down some of these corridors? It was really interesting. And I like that granularity and the fact that the mechanics were suggesting decisions to my players that they could make. I think that's really kind of like, can't be overstated, the value of mechanics like that. So that was something I liked. There's lots of random tables as well for treasure generation, really helpful. Another thing that I love, there's rules for opposing adventurer parties, different groups that are entering the Barrowmaze. And one of these parties, the Riders of Ulek, they really terrorized my players because what they were doing was they started to wait for my players to go in and clear out certain areas. You know, my players are full of treasure. They've carried as much as they can, but there's still loads left. And the Riders of Ulek were just going down and like grabbing these things and then leaving. And once the players worked out what was going on, they were really angry with this opposing adventurer party for kind of like, you know, like sniping their treasure. Really, really, really good fun. And what that did was, as well, which I enjoyed, was it sort of simulated a West Marcher style campaign where you'd have different groups of players competing with each other. This module would work really well for something like that. Different opposing groups of real players going against each other, but lots of colourful NPC adventuring parties. Really good fun. And then lastly, the art. Now, I'm going to talk about the book craft and the way it's laid out in a moment, but basically there's loads of art, and a lot of it's by old school artists, like actual old school artists and kind of like newer old school artists, but it is beautiful. And I love the idea of being given an art book and printing this artwork for my players to give them. It reminds me of the art books that you get in things like Expeditions to the Barrier Peaks. I've talked about that before. Click in the top right, watch my review of that. It reminds me of these kind of classic modules where you give out bits of art to have a look at. You know, Tomb of Horror is a really good example of that as well. Another classic module with an art book. So having said that, let's take a look at the book craft and the layout. So this is the actual book. As you can see, it's got this absolutely gorgeous artwork from Erolotus on the front. I've talked about Erolotus' artwork before when I did my video on Expedition to the Barrier Peaks in his own module, the House on the Island. I really, really, really like it. It's lurid, it's old school. I love the, I think it's Casablanca Antique or a similar font that's used as the cover. It's great. So opening it up, we get lots and lots of info. I'm going to show you, look at that, that's just great. So, nice table of contents, lots and lots and lots of art, organized in 2 columns. And one thing that I find really helpful is there's all these like little inset bits of information. We get this short map of where the Barrow Downs are kind of like where Barrowmaze is placed, part of this gazetteer. And there's two things going on this page that's really cool. One, this map is part of the outdoor survival map that was used by Gary Gygax when kind of working on outdoor rules. This fits on outdoor survival, which is a map from a board game by Avalon Hill. But it's cool that he's done that. But what I prefer, or what I think is more interesting, is this section here, which is this is each of the major locations against each other and how long it would take to kind of walk there, how far it is, and the timing. I find this really helpful. It's not quite kind of what's the word, like point crawling, but it is easy to understand. So I really, really appreciate that. Then we get a gazetteer of the area, Barrowmore, the Old Dwarf Bridge, the Marisk and the Blackwaters, the Moon Peaks, all these different locations. And then one thing that's really helpful is we get the different gods and goddesses of the area, and we get their kind of sigils and symbols, like really, really, really cool stuff around the Duchy of Eric. And it's really just nicely laid out. The alignment of different places. Remember, this is a classic module, so what alignment means is it's less to do with like how people act, and it's more because it's informed by Michael Moorcock and by Poul Anderson's conceptions of order versus or law versus chaos. It's more to do with a location's like cosmic allegiances rather than kind of how they behave. It's a gorgeous map of Helix. We get a kind of very short town that acts as a base. It's very much like Homlet or other kind of like starting towns. Some cool stuff going on though. You got the Wicker Man, and then we get into the maps of the Barrow Mounds itself. Now, this is the map. It's quite complicated. As I'm about to say, you should probably print this. We get nice random encounter tables for night and day, low and mid-level encounters and high-level encounters. All of this stuff serves to be really evocative. And while the book obviously is print on demand, so it's not the most robust in terms of its construction, it's not about to fall to pieces very easily. I absolutely adore this kind of like bordering, and it's really helpful, this bordering, the way it is, because it's integrated with the artwork. What it does is it really quickly helps you locate where you are in the book. The prose is really, really useful. There's not any box text, which some people will like, some people won't. But one thing that I do like is that everything is laid out really clearly in terms of, because obviously this is an old school system, we have the stat blocks and monsters integrated where they should be, all the different hit points of the monsters in this area. Some of the barrows are given maps if they're more complex, but most of them are just single chamber affairs. So they don't really have anything. They don't have maps, but if they are significant, if they're multiple rooms, then they're given it. I mean, I just think this stuff's great. You can pretty much kind of buy the book just for the Barrow Mound section, and then we get into the description of the of Barrowmaze itself. Now, what's going on here? Again, the different areas of the dungeon have this border that's quite specific, and again, it's just about helping you locate what we're looking at. But this is a really wonderful thing to add to your collection if you don't already have it. Now, lastly, let's talk about what I changed and what concerns you as a game master might have if you wanted to run Barrowmaze. Firstly, players need to be what I would say goal-orientated, and that might not be for everyone. I don't really think it is something that's very modern. And what I mean by goal-orientated is they have to want to go in and get treasure. That has to be one of the motivating factors. And they have to they need reasons to keep interacting with this thing, especially because a lot of the enemies are undead. They're not, apart from the intelligent undead, they're not going to be kind of projecting their influence really outside of the barrows that much. So players need reasons to keep going in. And to some extent, that is up to you as the game master to provide those reasons. And it is that's the difference, right? It's also up to the player to keep coming up with reasons. It has to be collaborative, but everyone has to be invested in doing this. My strong advice to you as a game master is do two things to make sure that this works. One, convey somehow, however you telegraph this, convey somehow that the presence of the Tablet of Chaos deep somewhere in Barrowmaze, this artifact of supreme sorcerous evil that needs to be gotten hold of so then it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Secondly, use those rival adventuring parties. And actually, lastly, the last thing I would do actually that I really would emphasize to you for providing goals is give them something to spend their treasure on that isn't just more stuff for like further delves into Barrowmaze. So I really like domain rules, and not all players do. but my players or one group in particular were getting their treasure out to then go and build like castles and breweries and all this kind of stuff, right? So they had something to spend their money on that became a bit larger than just going in, because that gameplay loop of going in, smashing, killing, grabbing treasure, coming out, getting the XP for it, that is good, but it's not a whole campaign's worth of adventuring. It just, or at least in my experience, it just isn't. The players aren't going to be, you're going to get 4 or 5 sessions out of that, and then they're going to be like, let's do something else now. I think some of your players rightly going to want a bit more kind of meat on the bones in terms of the narrative, and that's also cool. So what I would also do is I would give them a blank hex map. This is important. So the map for the Barrow Down section on the surface is a hex map, and there's a lot. So I would print that separately. I don't think you can actually buy Barrowmaze without also getting a PDF of it on drive-through. I'll put a link to it below. But if you are going to, make sure you print that page separately, so then when you've got the book, you don't have to kind of keep flipping between the sections. It becomes too difficult to manage. So print yourself the map, especially of the upper section, and then make sure you give the players a blank hex map for tracking it, and just tell them to give them the number of barrows. Like when they get to barrow 13, for example, say, okay, this is number 13. It'll make it really easy for everyone to at least kind of comprehend what they're doing. So that's like another thing that I'd really recommend. The thing is that this module really requires you to use dungeon crawling procedures. And what I mean by that is quite specific. It needs you to keep exploration in exploration turns. So 10-minute turns, how far the party can get in 10 minutes. Because that is useful for then conceptualizing lantern oil and how often you roll random encounters. I don't think this module would work with 5e. I don't think it would work with 5e at all. Because of the healing system in 5e, the fact that you get all your hit points back after a long rest, I don't think that's going to maintain any tension. So if they, as I described before, if the party clear out a whole area, but they can't bring all the treasure with them, but they're also badly injured, and they've got to weigh up, like, do we come back like the next day, even though we're badly injured, and try and grab some more of this stuff? Or do we risk a rival adventuring party coming in and stealing it? A party that get all their hit points back and can have a kind of true reset after each delve, it's not going to work. And also, it's going to burn them out on the novelty of that gameplay loop of smashing and grabbing and getting treasure much faster than they otherwise would be. So I would really recommend that you, if you are going to run it, you run it with exploration turns and proper dungeon crawling procedures. Now, if you did want to run it for 5e, what I would do is I would suggest that there is a kind of an underworld quality to Barrowmaze, that once you enter it, it's like entering a different plane. It's kind of like leeching onto the plane of undeath. It's like an liminal space between the Shadow Realm and here. And in being there, healing is much slower, and the healing of injuries inflicted here, like when Frodo is hit by the Morgul blade, any damage that you take here is going to take much longer to heal, because you need the adventuring day to not be a kind of reset every single time. Now, some people, as I mentioned earlier, some people have talked about the ubiquity of undead in this module, and how might that be boring? I don't think it is, because undead is just a catch-all term, right? In terms of, it actually covers a whole variety of undead. There's wights and skeletons and zombies, coffer corpses, liches, bone dragons. There's lots of different undead creatures, and actually, it's not just all undead. There's also harpies and gargoyles. There is also like lots of giant vermin. One of my favorite moments when game mastering this is when the players are trying to smash down a door to get into a barrow. They were on the surface in the fog, and they were failing. And I was like, okay, but you can try again, but it's going to have to be 10 minutes. You've got your exploration turn. You've been smacking out 10 minutes and not worked, so you're going to have to roll again. And this prompted a random encounter test, which resulted in 3 giant scorpions turning up. And one of them, this part was really low. One of them just got stung, like the stinger went straight through his chest and went, collapsed to the floor. Really good fun. So it's not just that it's undead, but also it wasn't an issue for any of my players. None of my players were like, oh god, this is boring. It's not like every enemy is just a zombie, because if you wanted to play that kind of campaign, that I would argue that would get boring. But undead is too much of a kind of term, a designator of actually a very large group of enemies. So I don't think that is such a problem at all, really. I would say, though, that while it's not a requirement, they are going to want a cleric with them. The cleric class exists because Dave Arneson needed a kind of anti-undead class, and that's what the cleric does. So you are going to need someone to be able to turn undead and manage that, because otherwise they're going to be at a significant disadvantage. Also, Thieves and Rogues is going to be really, really helpful for kind of disabling traps and all that kind of stuff. The last thing I would say is seed your world strongly with reasons to go to Barrowmaze, and lots of different reasons. And I would also say, as part of this, don't read the whole thing. If you read all, however many pages it is, like 400 pages, whatever I said, if you read, 200 pages, whatever it is, if you read all of it at once, if you decide you're going to have to read all of it before running it, you'll never run it. Read the introduction about the Tablet of Chaos. That's maybe 7 or 8 pages. Read maybe a couple of the barrows that are like at the western end where they're going to enter the Barrow Downs, and then just start running it. Just start running it. And I think that because of the quality of the writing, you can pretty much read it as you run it, which is exactly what I did. And I really like modules that are like that. Modules that that tend towards a low prep play, because some of us don't have loads of time to prep for our games. I know that some people who watch my videos in some comments have talked about how they have like 2, 3, 6, 10 hours, and they're like, oh, for my 2-hour game, I prep for like 6 hours. I just don't have time to do that. And I'm sure some of you guys don't either. So this is a really good module if you just want something where you can just literally pick up and play. You've got to read the first 7 pages or so and then just start running it. But give your players lots of reasons to go there. Let's just talk, and one thing that I haven't done before, but I just like to talk about a couple of sort of complementary fantasies that go well with this, other things, other media that I think you should maybe engage with if you're going to run Barrowmaze. So firstly, there's a really good H.P. Lovecraft short story called The Statement of Randolph Carter. It's like 2 pages long. You could read it in 10 minutes. And in it, I recommend reading it if you're going to run Barrowmaze. And the reason I recommend reading it is this is what happens in that short story. 2 characters enter a swampland, Randolph Carter and his friend Warren. And in this swamp, they find this kind of crumbling graveyard with various mausolea and sepulchres, and they break their way into one of these tombs. And what happens is Warren goes into the tomb, and there's something going on, and he's like screaming into the telephone. It's really good. The reason I recommend reading it is because of the quality of the vocabulary that is used for describing like rotting stonework and kind of like Icarus dripping filth. And I just think it's going to give you, in a very literal sense, a really good vocabulary for describing tombs and for describing kind of like forgotten passageways. So that's the first one, The Statement of Randolph Carter. The second one, obviously, you should reread, I think it's chapter 7 or 8. I think it's chapter 8 of The Fellowship of the Ring, the Fog on the Barrow Downs. Of course you should read that, right? Because Barrowmaze is directly informed by that chapter when, even though it's very famously missed from the Peter Jackson adaptations, the hobbits enter a kind of a rough hillside and get lost in the fog. Frodo realizes by himself they're surrounded by standing stones and dolmens and barrows, and that his friends have been captured by a barrow wight. I think that's really good for drawing on that folkloric medieval sense of kind of mound-dwelling Draug that you get in like Norse sagas. So you should reread. If you don't need to reread the whole book. Maybe you want to, but reread that section. And if you've never read it, read it for the first time because it's Tolkien, so the prose is perfect. And then lastly, another game that does undead burial mounds, albeit a video game. Skyrim, got your Draugr burial mounds. You should probably replay a few of the large ones, Bleak Falls Barrow. It's just going to give you a sense of like gamist escapism and how mounds like this and undead like this are presented in games. I think that will be really, really helpful to just kind of, get you in the kind of tonal, atmospherics and mood. Now, that is Barrowmaze. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me. I've really enjoyed Barrowmaze. Like I said before, I'll put a link to it below, along with Dragonslayer, and a link to my own game, a free version of my own game, Journeyman Expert Master, which I used to run Barrowmaze. As ever, thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon. Thank you.